Welcome, everybody, to another Village Torah session. We are talking about this week's Torah portion, which is Emor. Now, Parashat Emor comes on the heels of, well, we are still in the book of Leviticus. What we've had the last 2 weeks are double portions. We've had two different Torah portions smushed together each of the past 2 weeks. Now we get one Torah portion all unto itself. I want to mention something as a follow up to what I mentioned last week. Leviticus 19 that we experienced in Kedoshim in last week's Torah portion, I mentioned that it is a potpourri. It is a variety. It has a lot going on, and it stands out because it's got so much variety, so many different things going on. Just to follow up on that, I had said beforehand in the chapters leading up to chapter 19, they were thematic chapters. They would be a chapter about one particular topic, and that was pretty much it. And that makes chapter 19 stand out. As we now pass that, we now see more chapters that are very thematic, which continues to make chapter 19 really stand out in its potpourri-ness and its variety of various commandments that it's got contained within it. We have in this week's Torah portion multiple things. We have commandments focusing towards on the Kohanim, on the priests. We have various offerings, but we also have of interest for us is in chapter 23. We have holidays. And it's not just, we can call it holidays sort of broadly. It's Shabbat and various other holidays. So it's really almost special times. Yeah, we could just call it holidays because Shabbat is it is a special day. It has a certain holiness to it. And this is really throughout chapter 23 here in Leviticus, it is a dedicated time to talk about these holidays, which we haven't really had so much of. And it will get again in Numbers 28 and 29 as far as various offerings to be brought, and we'll get it again in Deuteronomy. But here is just a nice packaging of all of them. One of the really fascinating aspects of this chapter, there are other chapters in Leviticus where God tells Moses and then to then tell the children of Israel all these different things. So it starts off with this statement. God tells Moses, go and tell the children of Israel all these different things, and then closes it off. Okay, so it's a nice little package. And one of the most interesting ones is in chapter 15, where it's here's a fancy word, it's chiastic structure, where it's kind of like if you think about it like a poem, A, B, C, B, A, and it starts off the way it finishes. It's kind of like an X. What we have in chapter 23, it's actually a collection of different statements where God addresses Moses to then go instruct the children of Israel. We actually have 5 distinct or discrete, separate, different sort of little packages of statements, as it were, from God to Moses to then relate to the children of Israel. And so we have in verses 1 through 43, we have each of these 5, and then it's closed off on verse 44, closing out the chapter when Moses then goes and executes what he's been told to, which is telling the children of Israel about all these different holidays. So, what are these holidays, you might be asking? We get in the very first 8 verses, we get not only Shabbat but Passover. It's a funny packaging. I wouldn't have expected these two to be combined into just one package, but here we are. That's how the chapter opens, talking about Shabbat and talking about Passover together. That somehow these holy days are combined as a package, which I'm not really sure why they are together. It's you know what? It's also kind of amusing. I'm gonna bring it up on screen, but it's also kind of amusing that we have that it opens up really in verse 2 that God says, "Speak to the Israelite people and tell them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim." And we got ahead of ourselves, which you shall proclaim, and I don't know where we're going. Okay. Yes, fixed time of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions. And then we have in verse 5, Shabbat. 6 days work may be done. On the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred occasion. You shall do no work. It shall be a Shabbat of the Lord throughout your settlements. One liner about the Sabbath, the Shabbat. Verse 4, we have, these are the set times of the Lord, the sacred occasions, which you shall celebrate each at its appointed time. And we get Passover, right? We have it in the next 3 verses talking about observing it. I'm sorry, 4, next 4 verses. Okay, so we have on this basically this week we shall not, right? It's a holiday. But then we have, so that's clearly that seemingly, at least as it's positioned, that is the first one. Then we have in verses 9 through 22, we have the next 14 verses, we have about harvesting, what to do about harvesting. Now this, I'm not going to go through all of it, but it is talking about, it pretty much goes through the entire spring harvesting season, where we have, when you harvest the grain, you know what, I'm going to bring it back. When you enter the land, which is Israel, that I am giving to you, and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. He shall elevate the sheaf before the Lord for acceptance in your behalf. The priest shall elevate it on the day after Shabbat, and you shall do these things. Now, interesting. Now, there's no necessarily holiday that's mentioned. It's talking about what happens when you bring this offering. And then, however, so after counting off 7 weeks or 50 days, then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. And there's all these different offerings in relation to what do you do with the priest. And ultimately, here in verse 21, on that same day you shall hold a celebration. It shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall not work at your occupations. This is a law for all time and all your settlements throughout the ages. Now, this is a really nice way to close. Actually, this statement off is by saying, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, nor gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God, which is a kind of repetition from what we had experienced in chapter 19 last week of leaving this corn or this payoff for the strangers to come and reap. So harvesting, it's a strange package because we have all these different times. We'll get some other ones, don't worry, but it really only has, out of these 14 verses, only the second to last one really talks about the holiday. And yet it's also about the leading up to it. As we saw, the 7 weeks, the 50th day ultimately is the day to celebrate. But it's also a way of, I mean, it's funny because we can talk about connection and disconnection. The connection here is between the land and celebration. The celebration is clearly connected to the material, the physical, what we are harvesting, and that it's a sort of an indebtedness, that we feel a sense of gratitude for God, that we bring these grains and then make these sacrifices of animals, right? So these are, we're praising God, we're really giving of ourselves, of what we've got, and we celebrate at that 50th day. Nowadays we call it Shavuot. That celebration day is Shavuot, and it's this year, it will be coming up very soon, actually, on the 17th and 18th of May. So it's coming up very soon. It's just in a couple of weeks. So that is the holiday of Shavuot, which is kind of funny because it's a little oblique there. It's sort of just mentioned in the harvesting stuff. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know about you, if you've ever read chapter 23 in Leviticus, looking through all the different holidays, you've probably skipped over that part because it talks about harvesting this, harvesting that. And here's the point of disconnection. I mentioned connection and disconnection. Here's the point of disconnection. We don't live in an agrarian society for the large part. I've never been a farmer. Likely you've never been a farmer. And so there's a big disconnect with the way that we live our lives, and that we don't, and also this is talking about when we come into the land. So in as much as many of us have, perhaps most of us, not been farmers, probably very few, if any of us, have ever farmed in the land of Israel. So but nevertheless, even though even though it is um, sort of contextual about coming to the land of Israel, nevertheless, what is fascinating is the way that the verse states that it is actually in that verse 21, this is a law for all time and all your settlements throughout the ages. So so according to this, it's not contingent upon where or when you are. Even outside of the land of Israel, it's a date to be celebrated, even without the harvesting aspect. Okay, then we get to the third out of five, if you want to think about it, the middlemost of these, in which we have Rosh Hashanah. We have Rosh Hashanah, and really it's just a couple of verses. It really is 23 introducing it, and then 24, 25. That's it. That's Rosh Hashanah. And really all it is about, it is a Shabbaton Zichron Teruah Mikra Kodesh. It's a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. And also not working at our occupations and bringing an offering by fire. But it's a really simple day, at least in the framing of the context of Leviticus 23. It's a Zichron Teruah. It's a day commemorated with loud blasts. Yom Kippur, though, gets more treatment. And it's funny, actually, thinking about sort of more broadly what's going on. Aside from Shabbat, which really just gets that one line, Rosh Hashanah gets the next amount of fewest verses. There's very little about Rosh Hashanah here. Yom Kippur gets more of a treatment here. It's a pretty important day, and I mean, the way that it's positioned here is a much more significant day than Rosh Hashanah. That it is a uh, it says it's a Yom HaKippurim. It's a day of atonements. It's a holy Mikra Kodesh Yelachem. It's a holy sacred occasion for you. V'ini tem es nafsho sechem. So you shall. This is an interesting. I don't like this translation of practicing self-denial, but you shall afflict your bodies, basically. And then not doing work throughout that day, all these things. What's really important here is verses 29 and 30. Any person who does not do these, basically, the sages understood it to be 5 different things: fasting, a bunch of other things. But anybody who doesn't shall be cut off from their people, and whoever does, I will cause that person no longer to be part of that people. So, um, yes, it's supposed to be a Shabbaton. It's a day of complete rest, or a Sabbath of Sabbaths. And you shall, again, v'ini tem es nafsho sechem, you shall afflict your bodies. What's and then it also finishes off with Tishpatu Shabbatchem, and basically it's like really intense Sabbath. So it's like fully restfulness, be rest. I don't know if I can more fully pull on the rhetorical threads there of it's really about resting, also afflicting one's body. But also what's really fascinating there is we don't have with any of the other with any of the other holidays or special times, if you're not doing it, you're going to be cut off from your people. But with Yom Kippur, it seems to be that's an important piece of it, that it's a very deeply significant day as part of what it means to be part of the children of Israel, of what it means to be part of the people, and that by not taking part in it, one is cut off, is no longer part of the people. Somehow it's I don't know, intrinsic, maybe one might say. And then finally we get in the final 11 verses before, of course, the 44th verse, we have Sukkot, and we have the Feast of Booths, and it is Chag HaSukkos. It is the Feast of Booths, and we have all these different things on the first and the 8th day. They're holidays, and ultimately, what we well, actually, the funny thing is we also have Ba'as B'chem et Tuvot Haaretz, that we have gathered in the yield of our land. So this is also sort of marked as the harvest festival, not as significantly seemingly as bound up in the harvest as we saw with Shavuot in the spring, but still it's part of it. But just to make things a little bit interesting, we have in verse 40, we have taking these various arboreal or tree products. You're supposed to take them. Unclear what we're supposed to do, but the usmachtem, that joyfulness, is an important piece of it, and it's meant for everybody. It says Basukot Teshvu Shivat Yamin Kol HaEzrach B'Yisrael Yeshvu Basukot. All citizens. So, well, people are supposed to do it. Everybody's supposed to dwell in them. And here's what's fascinating: we don't necessarily have for the other pieces, the other holidays, necessarily a reason given. Here, straight out at the very end of this piece, we have a very clear, concise articulation of why this Sukkot holiday is to be celebrated. Laman yedu dorasechem ki b'Sukkot hoshafti es b'nei Yisrael ba'osi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Adonai Elohechem, in order, or so that future generations may know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I, the Lord your God. I I don't know about you. I find that out of all of this, all 44 verses in chapter 23, to be the absolute most fascinating aspect, because I think for me, and this might just be me personally, there's so much in here. There's so much fascinating aspects out of here. But for me personally, I love it when we get reasons for things. I think I might have shared with you previously that that when it comes to thinking about anything, especially with particular commandments or mitzvot, or even if we were talking about holidays, I like to think about who, what, when, where, why, and how. I like to think about that, to break it down, to help me understand what are the components of it, what is going on here. For me, when it comes to so many, even just within this chapter, there's not really a lot of why being presented. There's just not. Yeah, sure, we get the who, get some of the what and the how, and we certainly get when. I mean, when is very clear. We get specific dates for most of these, but the why, we only get the why for Sukkot. And there it's Leman Yedu Dorasechem, in order that your generation should know, or that you should be in. It kind of reminds me of like Passover, where we have the Passover Seder to help get the younger people to ask, so that we can then impart the story of the origin of our people. And here it's a similar model as Passover. It's an 8-day long thing. The first and 8 day, the first and 8 days are holiday days, and that we have the whole purpose of it, of dwelling in these Sukkot, is to remind our various generations that God caused us to dwell, basically provided us shelter at a point in time of vulnerability of our people. So it's really fascinating when we look back. This is like the primary aspects of our holiday cycle. Really, is to have the very first one, which really is foundational to our people and the way that we think about time and keeping time, is Shabbat. Every 7 days, we have a day of rest. We relax, we sort of refresh, and Passover is at the beginning. Passover is at the beginning of the entire holiday cycle, and then we get the whole harvest cycle, which I'm sure meant a lot more when we were much more agrarian of a people and a society. Obviously, it's a lot less, but we still have Shavuot that we celebrate. And then moving on into the fall, we have Rosh Hashanah. It's a day of blasts. Then we have Yom Kippur, which seems to be very, very important, at least to the practices of our people, because it repeatedly in this chapter talks about people being cut off for not observing the soul, the afflicting a body. And then finally we have Sukkot, which throws in happiness, right? Smachtam, that we should be happy. So just it's a really lovely, it's a fascinating way of packaging. And like I said, it's almost like 5 different statements from God to Moses to tell the Jewish people, the Bnei Israel, and they're all being packaged together, all 5 of these statements about these 6 different times. So I don't know if you've ever thought about chapter 23 in Leviticus or holidays in this way before. And this is, again, not the only statement of these holidays in the Torah. We get them again, but this is certainly a very sort of a compact version of them. So once again, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. And thank you again so much for watching. Shabbat shalom.